So as I get started here, I'm going to give you a little bit more background, although that was a great intro, thank you very much, about why I'm up here and what my background is to bring some of the perspective on the industry. Then I want to talk about the XR spectrum. If you're not familiar with the term XR, it's kind of a placeholder for VR, AR, and MR. I think of it as insert your reality. We got tired of talking about all three at once all the time, so we just shortened it. Next, I want to talk about the move to mobility, not just mobile hardware, but also non-tethered experiences. After that, I'm going to talk about the AllinOne. This is the new emerging standalone mobile VR headsets that we're seeing coming onto the market. Then I'm going to take a path into augmented reality and mixed reality and say why that is part of the future for virtual reality. Next, I want to talk a little about what some of the opportunities are for our developers and content creators, some of the challenges we're going to face, and why ultimately in the end, VR will not disappear and is going to not be a fad, but something that will be part of our lives for a long time. So just kind of recapping the intro, I've been involved in game engine technology, not really the content side, but the engine side for a little over a decade. Out of college, I made a startup with the idea of creating hardware-accelerated games for the web. Unfortunately for us, there was this other company called Unity that started ahead of us by about 2 years. So rather than compete with them, I joined them. Did a number of projects there, but most recently I've spent the last 2.5 to 3.5 years pretty much dedicated to VR. And in my role, I lead our team that is responsible for our technical partnerships with all the major VR HMD companies. So we work closely with Oculus, Sony, Google, Microsoft, and Valve. And as part of this partnerships with these guys, we have a really unique opportunity to see at least part of their future roadmaps, which helps us make sure that our engine is prepared for the future and gives us a little bit of insight of where we think the industry is going to be going in the future. So next I'm going to talk a little about the XR spectrum. This diagram is probably familiar to many of you. What I really want to focus on here, though, is where are we going to be in this spectrum in the future? So today on the left, you have the traditional virtual reality immersive experiences we're used to, which brings with it a set of different technologies like 6 degrees of freedom track controllers, which gives us really precise way of reaching out and picking up objects. It also gives spatialized audio, which accounts for your head, so we can actually know where your ears are and spatialize that audio, and it helps with that immersive experience. On the other side of the spectrum, we have traditional augmented reality. Many of you might know this as something like Pokemon Go. And Apple also recently announced ARKit, which I want to touch on in this talk. But the AR side introduces a lot of important pieces of technology that I believe are going to make their way into the virtual reality side and ultimately help the technology improve. So to give you an example of that, if you take the inside-out tracking and object recognition that we're seeing on augmented reality, and that technology bridges into virtual reality, we'll be able to have future headsets where you can say something like, show me my soda can, and in your virtual immersive experience, we'll be able to blend in where your soda can is on your desk. You'll be able to reach out, see your physical hand, sip it and set it back down, and go right back in the immersive experience. I believe small things like this are ultimately going to help the success of VR long-term, as they will allow you to stay within immersive experience and not have to deal with some of the clunkiness that many of us may experience, especially if you have glasses or something. You don't really want to be taking the headset on and off. So the more we can do to allow the real world to come into our immersive experiences when we want it, the better. So ultimately, I believe we're going to find ourselves somewhere in the middle, whether it's called mixed reality or something else. Doesn't really matter, but we're going to see a convergence of all these technologies in the near future. So, move to mobility. So we've already seen some mobile VR headsets. We've seen the Daydream, Gear VR, for example. But this is really just the beginning. And the move to mobility is more than just the mobile hardware. It's the fact that having non-tethered experiences are going to be critical to the success of VR. How many of you have been in an experience where you're playing an immersive game and you feel that the cable under your feet and it immediately pulls you out of that experience because you realize you need to adjust yourself so you don't trip? So we want to avoid that as much as possible, and having non-tethered experience is going to be really critical for that. Also, inside-out tracking is going to enable us to not have to actually set up a space ahead of time. It'll allow us to just start our VR experience wherever we are and be able to have a solid experience. And the other big thing about mobile is that this self-contained hardware is much lower cost, especially if you think more globally and outside of the United States. Like for China, for instance, many people in China have a phone, and that is their connection to the internet and their connection to the world, and they're unlikely to make an investment into dedicated PC hardware in their home just to have a VR experience. So in order to have the broadest market, we really need to see VR move more into the mobile. The other thing about mobile is there's much faster evolution on the mobile side. We're unlikely to ever see mobile hardware overtake PC hardware, but what we may see is that mobile chips will actually become specialized, and we'll be able to move things like SLAM solutions into hardware, into specific chips, and offload that from the PC, enabling those systems to be very successful. And finally, it's about the portability factor. With mobile VR, you are able to put a headset on an airplane. You're able to bring it to your friend's house. You can have much more social experiences, although I'll get into the social aspect a little later, and why that's still a better improvement over what we have with, like, say, a game console today. So now I want to talk about the all-in-one, and you may be familiar with these in the news lately. Qualcomm has a reference design. Google has announced an all-in-one headset later this year. Intel has Project Alloy, and there's a bunch of other ones. I believe HTC announced one last week. So you may ask, like, why are we suddenly seeing all these come onto the market? Well, we had to start somewhere. Mobile phones were a close enough thing to where we needed to be, so we built the tech on top of mobile phones. But ultimately, mobile phones aren't the future of mobile VR. I would predict that these new all-in-one devices, while they may not be the top selling per device, they're probably going to be the most successful stores. And there's a couple reasons for that. For one, it's dedicated hardware. So we're no longer building on top of what ultimately in your pocket is meant to be a phone. We can't turn off the phone services. There's limits we can do. But with dedicated hardware, we can do a lot more software and hardware optimizations for a more high-fidelity experience. It's also purchased for a singular purpose. So the people that are buying this are making that investment because they're passionate about virtual reality. But that's going to come with some different expectations by these users. They're going to look for longer experiences. They're going to look for better input, so they're not going to want to be limited to just rotation, position, and yaw. They're going to expect 6 degrees of freedom. They're going to expect to be able to walk and have that experience move with them. And they're also going to expect higher quality experiences. So today, a lot of the mobile games we see on mobile VR are rather short and can improve in quality and time. And the other interesting thing about these headsets is they're end-to-end immersive experiences. From the time you don it on to don it off, you're in virtual reality the entire time. You're going to be going through the store in virtual reality. You're going to be going through app selection and sitting in virtual rooms and being able to have social experiences in those rooms when you're not in games. So I want to take a moment to just step over into the augmented reality, mixed reality world and why I think it matters. If you think about it, trying to convince your brain that you're somewhere else completely different is a really hard problem. But it's not as hard to convince your brain that there's something else in the world we're in. So I believe that this is a great way to introduce many people into immersive experiences. Augmented reality also has a much higher, greater day-to-day value to the average consumer because we can replace everyday electronics with augmented reality. You can imagine a future where you can remove the TV from your home and you just have a virtual TV there when you're sitting on your couch. And here I'm really talking about a future where augmented mixed reality is head-mounted. It's a pair of glasses, not the magic window things we're seeing today. And there'll be world persistence, so you'll be able to persist a TV there. You'll be able to have a friend over, and if they're wearing their glasses, that virtual TV will also be there. But it has the flexibility of being able to go lay in your bed and having a TV on the ceiling of your room. And you could also imagine smart homes where someone knocks on your door and you just look at the door and you can see through that door and see who's on the other side. It also has a lower barrier for developers and consumers. And the reason I say this, if you look at something like ARKit, which is based on existing iOS phones, it's already in millions of people's pockets without any additional cost. This is a fantastic way for us to market what we're doing, get it out into the world, and allow the technology to take off. So AR ultimately will make VR a success. I believe AR will be a vehicle to the success of VR by pulling in consumers into more immersive experiences and really being a stepping stone to bringing more people into VR. For a lot of people, there's a little bit of stigma that they don't really want to put one of these headsets on, but as people get used to wearing augmented reality glasses, it isn't much of a leap to say, well, why don't you put on a pair of glasses that you can't see through? So as AR adoption grows, so too will the acceptance of VR. Secondly, I believe, as I was saying in the XR spectrum, that the technologies we're developing in AR are going to lead into better virtual reality experiences. And another example of this is, as we bring in spatial understanding into VR, we can start making procedurally generated virtual worlds which augment themselves to the space you're in. So whether you're in a small apartment in Tokyo and you want to scale that room down, or whether you go out into Central Park in New York and make a completely different version of that park, people in different parks or different places in the world can experience the same content in a different way that's adapted to the space around them. And I believe this is a much better way of, if you think about the boundary systems we have today with modern day headsets, you pretty much just know where the walls are, but you don't know where the couch is. But imagine if you could put crates where the couch is and make it so without even having to take someone out of that immersive experience, they know naturally that they don't want to walk in that space. It's harder to make this content, but I think it's a new generation of content that will be really compelling. So what are some of the opportunities? We truly are in the forefront of a fundamental shift in how humans interact with computers. I think this is just as big as when the mouse was invented, and now we've all become accustomed to dealing with mouse and keyboard. Also, make sure you're considering more than just the US market. And I'm not just talking about the cultural differences, but also like what are the space constraints and budget constraints of people around the world. In Tokyo, you're unlikely to have a 3,000 square foot house with a spare room to do, attract space. But again, if you can procedurally generate that world and turn someone's apartment into an experience, that will allow us to target a much broader market in the world. Also, make sure you think outside of games. There's actually more money being spent on the enterprise side in automotive and in healthcare, communication, real estate, architecture. All these things are taking off. And so if you can find a way, maybe you're passionate about building games, but this might be a great way to actually fund future endeavors by finding a niche market right now and bringing virtual reality and augmented reality to those markets. So what are some of the challenges we have to face? Well, for one, hardware fragmentation. And this is only going to get worse in the coming years, and eventually will get better. But hardware fragmentation makes it really hard to take your content and target it to a lot of different places. So while there is a large overall VR market, it's spread across many different devices. In order to be successful, you really need to not just target one device, but as many as possible. So there are tools like game engines like Unity are trying to help you have the maximum reach possible. And we do that by doing abstraction over all the different hardware, working with those partners, trying to solve the hard problems for you and allowing you to focus on content creation. So I just want to close with why I don't think VR will ever disappear. So fundamentally, the virtual immersive experiences we have can be mind-blowing and take you to a different place entirely. And that's not something that augmented reality will ever displace. As I mentioned, AR is actually going to help the success of VR long-term. So as the technology, the cost of technology lowers, as we see increased standardization, the economic success for VR will become greater and greater. Great, so thank you all for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to answer.
Scott, I have a quick question. In the deck that you had for challenges, one of the challenges that I've become aware of, and I want to see if you have an opinion or comments on, is the health risks that AR and VR may be introducing to people as your eyes see something and have to recalculate with your brain. Do you have any insight on that?
Not specifically on that. I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of safety risks even outside of that. Like, we haven't really seen the first lawsuit of someone falling down a flight of stairs or something like that. So I think we have to be very careful and develop technology to try to make as safe an environment as possible. But I think in terms of like the, what the eye strain is and things, those are kind of still being figured out. But as not being on the hardware side, it's not a problem we're as closely tied to.
And then from the side of the business that Unity works with, what kind of feedback are you able to provide to the hardware makers and the manufacturers to give them some insight on what's going on the engine side?
Quite a bit. There's actually a really good partnership between all these companies. So for instance, when we do like performance analysis and stuff, we can go back and try to actually ask the hardware companies to develop new API or new solutions to help offload that into hardware. And that's something that's been ongoing. And so, where we were from 2 years ago to today has actually improved greatly, and primarily because we've moved more and more things into newer hardware APIs.
So, the fact that you're a lawyer actually brought up a good, it's going to go into my question here just a little bit. I used to work at a big, large software company back in the day where the transition from green screens to mice and things like that happened. And one of the big things, which was unintended consequence, people who had accessibility issues feared for their jobs, and eventually lawsuits happened. Okay, end of the story intro. What are you thinking about as an engine provider to before, I see VR, CR, mixed reality, whatever you want to call it, and I see the potential of not thinking about people being left out. I am a reporter now, and I work with a person who has accessibility issues. And right now, most of these experiences, he cannot participate with me in. And at some point, people get frustrated. And at some point, there's people who do your profession who look at frustrations as economic opportunities. And I'm not saying that's chasing ambulances. I just said that's the facts of life and sometimes how we move society forward. So maybe we can not avoid because you brought up the mouse, maybe we can avoid that transitional pain and a lot of with it. But I think a lot of it falls upon you as an engine provider to provide the tools. Have you been looking at that as we move forward? Because touch and smell and sense could get involved in all this. And one person, we have a lot of people who survived war efforts now in North America and other parts of the world who would have died even the last time we went to have nice little parties elsewhere in the world, who are now there and want to be engaged, want to work in the workforce. And like you said, it's just not about games, it's in the workforce. So these people are going to feel threatened at some point when they can't participate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think even on the non-accessibility side, no one's really solved what input looks like in VR, and I think ultimately what you'll see long-term is there has to be a lot of flexibility there. And content creators are going to have to program into their games that there's many different alternative ways that someone, for instance, will move around. So like on the room scale experiences, a lot of people have made mechanisms for teleportation where you're able to basically say where you want to teleport to, and that could be done through a number of different means. It doesn't require actually the physical mobility, but through some other either using like a finger to point or speech, you could position yourself. So I think that we're on the engine side, we're making it so we're very flexible and offering and allowing for any means of input, but we'll also have to see on the hardware side where people create the physical devices that augment that.
When you're designing tools for APIs and things for creators, are you actually even discussing yet people who have those issues? Because I find the discussion, even when you go, I don't know, but it becomes a work item to figure out. Because let's face it, I agree with you that we're the total wild, wild west, but we're going to start getting things. Teleportation is what you brought up there is one of the things I tell people in a story I just did. Teleportation will never go away if you like it or not because it's going to enable things. That's the first, I consider, accessibility issue for some people is that they can teleport in these in some of these systems. They'll stick around even if you can walk around at some point physically. Are you guys looking and actively soliciting your developer communities and your hardware people to say, hey, are we thinking about that?
Well, we're not even that far. Like, we're really, at Unity anyway, we're at a much more abstract level where we're trying to have full flexibility that you can do anything with input versus actually building up what those inputs look like, because we don't believe that the developer community has solved all those problems yet. So we tend to lag behind a little bit on like waiting until we see things emerge that are worth investing in, as opposed to necessarily like creating those things from the forefront.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Adam Vance, and we do a lot of VR testing and VR user experience work. And I was just wondering to what extent you have to take into consideration, from Unity's standpoint, the importance of diversity in the user experience. I think we're seeing a lot of challenges in that area, but I'm wondering from the game engine side if that's a concern or something you need to work with outside of hardware.
And do you just mean in terms of like the types of applications that can be created?
Yes, but also the diversity in user experience as far as height, size, just all of the actual physical mobility elements that come into concerns with usability.
Yeah, so we are making a lot of investments into trying to allow content creators to make their content much more adaptive. So things like being able to create statistics of how tall you are, what is your arm reach, what is the size of the room you're in, where are the objects in that room. And right now, a lot of the content that's created is fairly statically created with a singular way, but we're definitely building the tools out to try to push developers into thinking that as a more of adaptive experience into who's playing. Like I have small kids and they like to do VR sometimes, and I oftentimes have to pick them up so they can grab something off a table or something like that, and we want to definitely encourage developers to address that.
Fantastic. All right.
All right,
Well,
thank you,
Scott,
everyone.
Thank you.